Just to let you know, we'll wait for another 2-3 minutes while other participants are joining. In case you wish to ask Q&A, wish to ask questions, please roll over with your mouse and see the pop-up menu there. You can raise questions throughout the webinar, and in the end of the presentation of the speakers, we will pick up those questions, as many as we can, and hopefully we'll be able to answer all of them. You can also use the chat function, either to everybody or just to some speakers, to some panelists. Let's just wait for another 2 minutes, and then we start. As more and more people come in, we have decided to wait a few minutes and while still many people come in to give them the chance to hear the first few minutes too. Hi Sunil, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining from India. All right. I think we should start as we wish to close the session as well on time. My name is Christian Franz of CPC Analytics. I am the facilitator of the community of practice on NCDs and commercial determinants of health. And I will also guide you through this webinar today. We have 3 to 4 fantastic panelists. One is still pending, so let's see whether she can join later. Let me just give you an overview of how we will go about this webinar. And first, I will give you a brief welcome, then the WHO GCM team, represented by Guy Fones, will say a few things about what are communities of practice. And then I will give you an idea of how we started, what we did over the past weeks to get this community of practice on commercial determinants of health started. And then we open it to the panelists. We'll start with Jeff Collin, and then Charlotte and Tim will follow, and Robert will close the panelist session. Just a few comments about the software or the platform that we're using. You can raise questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A section. When you roll over your screen and select the Q&A button at the bottom, you will be able to hopefully ask controversial questions or critical questions, and we very much look forward to that later after the panelists spoke. I would give now the word to Guy. Please let us know what the GCM has been working on, what the communities of practice are.
Thanks. Thank you, Christian. A warm welcome to not only the panelists, I'm very honored to have you on the panel, but also to all the participants who are signing on as we speak. I think 54 already. This is really exciting. 54 participants. But hello to everybody. My name is Guy Fones. I'm acting head for the Global Coordination Mechanism for Non-Communicable Diseases at WHO. It's a very exciting moment for us. We are extremely pleased to launch this exciting initiative on NCDs and the commercial determinants of health as part of our growing portfolio of communities of practice. Many of you may know, but the Global Coordination Mechanism, the GCM, is WHO's first and only multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral engagement platform for NCDs. We are very proud of having completed our first 5 years of such an exciting platform. And in doing so and looking forward, we are trying to enhance many of our priority streams and work activities. One of these is our strong work stream on knowledge dissemination and engagement around the knowledge, information, and evidence-based resources. And we are happy to already announce that the new community of practice that you are participating in today will form part of the growing portfolio of additional communities that we've launched since 2013, 2014. And these will now become part of a new initiative we're going to launch this Thursday, 22nd of November, which is the GCM's Knowledge Action Portal, the CAP, on NCDs, a very comprehensive portal on resource, information, evidence-based, country cases, best practices, interaction, engagement, and information on NCDs. The main point here being interaction, inspiration, and information for all of our GCM participants, including those that are online today. It's an exciting moment, and this community of practice will now be housed again on the CAP, which will provide many additional functionalities and opportunities to engage further and interact with other participants, other partners. This particular community of practice is a very exciting one in a sense because it is probably one of the few of our 10 or so communities of practice, the ongoing communities of practice, that has been mandated specifically by WHO member states. Through one of the very strong intergovernmental negotiated documents that came out of WHO, which is called the Montevideo Roadmap, member states requested the GCM to provide a space, in particular through its community of practice platform, to address what they called at that moment economic, market, and commercial factors that impact on NCDs. That later became to be known as the community of practice on commercial determinants of health, which we are launching today. So this is a direct request from our member states. They want to understand how to address these factors. They want to understand how they can discern between those factors that are detrimental and those factors that are certainly beneficial to health, and how they can enhance some of those beneficial factors going forward. So this is an exciting moment. Member states are waiting for this, but more than member states, I think the solutions and the responses will come from across partners and stakeholders who have a role and a responsibility in many of these factors. So without further ado, I just want to wish you the best of engagement and interaction on this discussion. We will be following you and supporting you throughout the process. We're also very pleased to welcome the Global Health Center from the Graduate Institute in Geneva as co-host, and in particular appreciate Christian's facilitating role throughout the whole length of the community of practice discussions, which will take on several discussion themes and sessional discussion sections. So I leave it to Christian to give you more details on the community of practice itself. But please, again, understand this is an exciting initiative for us, and we are responding directly to member states' urgent requests and challenges. So thanks, Christian.
Thank you very much, Guy. I think it's super exciting to see the Knowledge Action Portal getting launched, and also in that way bringing together the different activities of the GCM, and also being able to showcase what all is done. Let me maybe now just use 2 or 3 minutes to give you an idea where we came from. with the idea for this community of practice, and it was really born out of discussions between the GCM and the Graduate Institute in Geneva, namely Professor Kickbusch, who I worked with on a paper on commercial determinants of health in 2016. So nevertheless, the whole topic remained an emerging concept. But that shouldn't mean that there is no research so far on how corporations affect health in a detrimental or a beneficial way. We will hear a lot of that from Jeff, I'm sure, so I will be short on that. And let me just say how this webinar is embedded into the next steps. We will work in the community of practice over the next 12 months on different topics related to the commercial determinants of health. Every 2 months, we plan to have a webinar like this. And as we progress, of course, the scope will be more and more precise and more detailed. Whereas this first webinar aims at really kicking off our debate. That's why the subtitle was also chosen, Towards a Productive Debate. If we are able to identify after that webinar what exactly those commercial determinants of health are, then we have made already a big step. What do we want to bring about with a community on this topic? What we have seen is a lot of research on how the tobacco industry works, increasingly also how big soda or big food works. So, but at the same time, this has not been a unified strand of literature. Neither has it been a uniform set of understandings that we have developed. So in this community, we will bring together experts, both from academia and from practice. We will make a strong effort to reach out to industry within these sectors and really come to a point where we can point towards transformative examples, where we can point towards a unified understanding of how commercial actors also could be seen as health actors or can be transformed into health actors. So you're all invited to join the Knowledge Action Portal on Monday. Be sure we would also send you an email that would give you the exact detail where to log in. But these will be the rough pillars, the webinars, and then a theme-wise progress. In the end, as a result, what we will have as a result will be shaped by your participation, will be shaped by your practice examples, will be shaped by the opinions that you put in there. And with that freedom that we have on that portal in discussing the topics, but also in organizing events around it. So that could create a kind of understanding that we don't have right now. So I stop here. I give the word to Jeff. Jeff is a professor, as you can see on my shared screen, a professor of global health policy in University of Edinburgh, but he has long experience in identifying, researching on the governance at the intersection with the commercial sector. And Jeff, please enlighten us a bit on what you've done and how we can understand the status of the research at the moment.
That's great. Thank you, Christian. Christian gave me the slightly provocative title of NCDs and Commercial Determinants of Health. Do we know enough already? As an academic, I'm contractually obliged to say no, but as Christian's introduction also suggested, this has the benefit of being true. Of course, quite a lot of work has been done around the understanding how corporations impact on health. But as Christian said, it's a very uneven literature, and there's some really striking gaps in the evidence base. So while a lot of work has been done on the tobacco industry. A lot of work's been done on food and on pharmaceuticals. The literature on the alcohol industry is really tiny. So going back to 1950s, we've got a grand total of about 230 articles engaging in the alcohol industry in PubMed. And this indicates something of the challenges of getting funding for this kind of work, which I think is relevant to the broader issues that this community of practice is going to confront. There has been increasing interest and some really exciting work in recent years in looking at strategic similarities across unhealthy commodity industries, across tobacco, alcohol, and ultra-processed food industries in recent years. Some really interesting developments of schematics of corporate political activity, but I still think there's a lot more work to be done there, and we really haven't begun to scratch the surface of the work that I think really needs to be done in terms of understanding structural links across sectors and their relevance to health. So this rather strange-looking slide is a depiction of the merger between SAB Miller and...
Could you please share your screen? Sorry that I interrupted.
I do apologize. I thought I had. Apologies. Okay, are we there now?
If you now shift to PowerPoint instead of your... Yes, that looks good there.
Good. Okay, my apologies, everybody.
Wait, sorry to interrupt again. It's not yet there. Can you repeat what you just did once?
Yeah.
And click on the, yes, this one. And close maybe this window here. Yes. Now we need to select the other PowerPoint.
This was working swimmingly before.
Exactly. Yes, that looks good. Can you click on the three buttons and go to hide presenter view?
Okay.
And now you can select your usual presentation down there at the right bottom corner. Or you do it like that.
Are we okay?
Perfect. That looks great.
Apologies, everybody. So once we've got over my technological incompetence, hopefully we can get to some more interesting places. So as I was saying, and as Christian said, the work that's been done has been very uneven. I think we've got quite a good knowledge base of some industries. We've got increasing interest in strategic similarities across industries. I think we need to be developing a much clearer interest in terms of understanding the significance of structural links across unhealthy commodity industries for our understandings of the commercial determinants of health and for implications for public policy. But I guess, in terms of the context of this particular conversation, it's particularly important to recognize just how limited the work has been so far around developing the idea of the commercial determinants of health. So Christian and Ilona produced a really interesting paper, a much cited paper a few years ago, which offered a definition of the commercial determinants of health as strategies and approaches used by the private sector to promote products and choices that are detrimental to health. But I think if we're going to develop a definition of commercial determinants that's really useful, we need to be developing a much more expansive definition that also recognizes ways in which some commercial sector actors can contribute to health as well as impose damaging impacts. I think that we also need to think about what is the place of commercial determinants of health within other existing frameworks. So some colleagues in this space have sought to suggest the idea that we should be looking to develop a new scientific discipline. So Rob Moody and colleagues suggested that we need a new scientific discipline that investigates industrial diseases and the transnational corporations that drive them. I'd actually argue that this risks marginalizing what really ought to be an area of activity that's central to core public health. And that really, we also need to recognize that lots of what we're interested in when we talk about the commercial determinants of health has also been anticipated in earlier work on social determinants of health. You know, I think if we look, for example, at the WHO Commission, lots of the work on the socioeconomic and political context or social position clearly anticipates the kind of concerns that are now being articulated with reference to commercial determinants. Their call for recognizing the FCTC as a model that can be used in other areas is clearly consistent with those kind of concerns. I think we need to think about what a commercial determinants of health lens can add to existing social determinants frameworks, with which I'd say it is largely compatible. So, for example, I think it offers value in terms of highlighting the health impacts of discrete set of actors, and also crucially as offering sites of intervention that will allow us to move upstream in health policy discussions. You know, I would see a commercial determinants of health framework fully developed as offering, you know, scope for politically feasible engagement with modifiable structural determinants. It offers a lens through which we can look to tackle damaging health impacts and think about constructive ways of working with some parts of the commercial sector. We need to think about whether the commercial determinants of health label is a helpful one, and I think that analytically it's got a lot of value. Politically it might be quite challenging, and I think it is important to look back at the Montevideo process that was mentioned at the start of this, which began with a draft document calling on WHO to consider establishing a commission to address the commercial determinants of health. But we ended up with a commission that was established, but managed not to mention the commercial determinants of health. And similarly, if we look at the ways in which the lessons of commercial determinants literature, the lessons of recent work on corporate impacts on health have largely been ignored in the very disappointing political declaration agreed at the third UN high-level meeting. I think it says something about the kind of challenges that we need to engage with analytically and strategically in this field. And finally, I think to anticipate the presentations of other colleagues, we need to put this within a context of recognizing that we need much more work in terms of understanding appropriate terms of engagement with commercial actors. Now, obviously, lots of this has happened with FENSA, WHO's framework for engagement with non-state actors, but that's obviously remained a contentious and controversial process. We've got some really interesting developments in nutrition policy around the development of guidance within WHO to address and manage conflicts of interest. But we've still got really murky spaces in which all kinds of partnerships are being initiated, some of which will doubtless be helpful, others of which raise some important questions around conflict of interest that I'll leave to Robert to expand upon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I think there is a slight change now to the plan. We will come back to questions later. I would have a few already, but Charlotte couldn't join us. Apparently, we really hope that nothing happened to her and that she's fine. But in that case, we would move on directly to Tim. I remember, Tim, that you have some slides too.
I do, thank you. So if you'll permit me, I will share my screen. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Thank you. Okay, so let me try my screen share and see what I've got. No, that's you. Here we go. Have you got me on screen, my first slide?
No.
Oh.
Did you?
I have it here.
The green button or share screen, and then you need to select the right screen or the correct window on your computer.
Well, that's my screen, but that says you. Share that one. Okay. Do you have at least my...
That looks very good. If you now expand it,
yes,
That will be perfect.
Okay, so let's see if we can get a thing going. So what do you have now?
Perfect.
Okay, you have... Oh, okay, my colleague has now joined the webinar and can tell me what he's seeing, which is excellent. Okay, so I just wanted to take a step back from the content of what you were planning and actually be a little bit of a maverick here and start challenging the language we're using. And I do that because I want to be sure that we don't mistakenly perpetuate the wrong concepts or concepts that could be damaging to the cause we're trying to promote here, which is to improve the relationship between stakeholders and to get our causes of the disease, the causes of the causes sorted out. So I just want to look a little at the language we use. But first, let me try that. Yes, I should say a few words about the organization. Although I have a visiting professorship, I don't work in an academic sphere. I work for an organization that has members around the world, clinical research members, and it does some advocacy, both for patients and for prevention of obesity. So we work on obesity issues, and we're a federation, professional society and advocacy organization. Okay, now just take a step back to the 1970s when the UK government, and I was living in the UK at the time, still am, issued this wonderful guidance for health promotion called Look After Yourself. I think the title itself is a little bit worrying because it did imply, and it was very much the time zeitgeist for the 1970s, that people should look after themselves rather than be looked after. And I think particularly interesting was their guidance on obesity, which is a practical way to prevent obesity, is not to become overweight. And this really is sort of leaving it up to the individual and sort of assuming that, you know, if you become obese, it's because you failed in your attempts to stay healthy. And I think that doesn't help in our language. It was a language of, if you like, non-communicable disease, that there's no vector, it must be due to a lifestyle. I actually want to challenge this phrase, non-communicable disease, because in a sense, it is communicated. And I think many of us on the call today will recognize that the word non-communicable, though adopted by the WHO long way back, it was particularly unfortunate after the Montevideo that they perpetuate with this non-communicable disease commission. Because as we know, NCDs are being communicated through family practices, through school education, and of course through marketing messages. And that's an area that I've spent much of my life looking at. And these are, you know, these are vectors. There are vectors. They're toxic, or, and this was a wonderful phrase, obesogenic influences on behavior. And I think that's a very important shift of language from non-communicable to obesogenic. And if you want a good example of an obesogenic vector that goes from community to community, bringing disease with it as it goes, or at least bringing bad health behavior with it as it goes. This is a particularly good example that we're just about to be inflicted with here in the UK, the traveling soft drinks truck bringing sugar to everybody. Okay, so that's an example of a vector of disease, and I want to be sure we continue with the sort of language that does that, and we look at things like obesogenic shopping, where we know that, you know, what's on display is what gets bought, and the more it's displayed, the more it is bought by consumers. And what's on television? Leisure time. Children particularly spend almost, I think it's more hours, there were some calculations done, more hours in front of a screen, TV and internet, than they do in a classroom. And that's, you know, there's a big influence from television, and we have to be aware that these advertising that goes on television is going to be an influence on their understanding of the world, what they think is approved of by adults, and so on. If you look at the proportions of what is advertised, well, we know that we should be eating only a small amount of fatty and sugary foods and much more of fruits and vegetables, cereals, and so on. But what is advertised is quite the reverse. It's nearly all fatty and sugary foods, confectionery, breakfast cereals, soft drinks, and so on. So the proportion of marketing is really distorted against good health behavior. But it's not just advertising and marketing, it's actually products themselves. And if you take, if you like, the colors and flavors and tastes of healthy foods, and see what industry does to these. They take this, they take this, they take this. These are all examples of how, if you like, marketing or the drive to market, and I think we need to look upstream at the drive to what it is that creates profit in society, distorts our food supply and undermines health. I'll just give you another sort of example for children. These sort of normalizing of brands that we know encourage poor health behaviors, and putting it into children's lives at a very early age doesn't help health promoters. Can you get them to shut up a bit? Okay, another example is, no, just to summarize really what I've just been saying. Food choices versus food environments. Choice is not a very helpful word when it comes to lifestyle. We don't really have the choice we think we have. We walk around a supermarket. It's actually quite hard to get the sort of things we want healthily at a good price and not promoted. We know that, you know, as I said, sales displays promote, end of aisle promotes, eye-level promotion in supermarkets. Big, big influence on what we choose to eat. Getting exercise, similarly, it isn't always an easy choice. Finding cycle lanes, getting the public transport you need, safe streets and parks of play. I mean, a lot of people's lives are spent in communities like this, not a place where you can get easy exercise. And to tell people that, you know, they've got to influence their lifestyle, they've got to change their lifestyle to match good health behavior is pointless in a system like this. And I'll keep it short, but I just want to add one more sort of problem that we have with the sort of language we use and the images we have about weight gain and it being the individual's fault and the stigmatizing of individuals, the treating them as if they were lazy or ignorant or stupid because they've gained weight really, really doesn't help. And people absorb that stigma and become self-blaming. And that even means that they won't go and seek treatment or seek help. They'll just feel depressed because of it. And it bullies children at school and so on. So we really need to think carefully about our language, about what is the cause of the causes of obesity. And even weight loss. If you fail to lose weight, and it's not surprising, nearly everybody fails to lose weight. They might try, they might succeed briefly, but then it bounces back on again. Again, it's your fault. You didn't try hard enough. That sort of language really, really doesn't help us get on top of the issue. And it's not helped by public images, internet images, TV, media images of when there are obesity stories. These sort of headless, blaming individuals, these are really extreme cases of obesity, but they're being treated as if they're normal, but they are depersonalized and they encourage disgust. And that really, really undermines the sort of things that we want to be working towards. Just to say, there are libraries of good images now being made available, so you can have normalized and images that encourage some respect for people who might have excess weight. I don't think I need to say much more. I just want to sort of put that plea in that we need to be wary of the language we use when we talk about these issues. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thanks for sharing that these very intriguing pictures and your arguments. And interestingly, I heard there several aspects that got me thinking and that very much tie into the approach of this community of practice. You said at some point we need to think about upstream factors. So if we think of all these industries and we think what does upstream mean, we very quickly go beyond simple advertising. We go into the more structural elements. We maybe go into supply chains. We might even go as far as investor relations and what the investors behind those firms do to influence the strategy or avoiding other strategy. And another aspect that I found extremely interesting was the environmental question. So maybe our urban spaces or also rural spaces have a massive impact on what's going on. And that is not just the achievement or the misachievement of individual people. Neither is it the deed of an individual firm, but here all of us in these urban planning aspects, I believe. We need to think as a society.
Yes, if I can just
yeah.
come back on you. Obesity isn't just about the food industry, it's about the transport industry, the building industry, the advertising agencies, the media. In fact, there's hardly an industry we can think of, oil production, that isn't related to the type of environment we live in and hence the diseases we suffer. So, yes.
Right. So, but nevertheless, in many of your pictures, and this brings me to Robert, in many of your pictures, what we see is the firms that we always see when we go to supermarkets, at least in Western countries. So then at the same time, the policy approach with which I entered, in a way, global health that is popular right now is one of, we need to speak to people, we need to speak to firms, we need to engage them, we need partnerships. So that was the question that I asked to Robert in our invitation email. So partnerships, what should that look like in a world where there seem to be no easy distinctions between bad guys and good guys, and something in between maybe? Robert, the word is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian. Can you hear me okay?
Very well, actually.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Christian, for the invitation to speak here. Thank you as well to the co-sponsors, to WHO and the Graduate Center. And it's also great to see so many participants, colleagues, and friends. I don't have any slides, so but I'm going to talk about the need to reconsider public-private partnerships and partnerships broadly in the new era of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to argue that we should partner and work with the private sector when this partnership helps us achieve part of Sustainable Development Goal 3 for health. But we shouldn't partner with certain industries within the private sector, obviously tobacco, but also alcohol and some parts of the food industry, as they're not compatible with SDG 3. I think in the global health community, we cannot, quote unquote, partner under the influence. And a lot of this is about accelerating the transition from the MDGs to the SDGs. And in other words, also reconciling SDG 3, the goal for health, with SDG 17 and the focus on partnerships. So maybe just a bit of perspective and building back and drawing a little bit on the other presentations as well. I mean, I think in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, at the kind of dawn of the MDGs, there was an explosion, there was a proliferation of public-private partnerships. It was really the kind of pinnacle of partnerships. There was the Global Fund to fight HIV, TB, and malaria. There was the Gavi partnership on vaccines, and kind of countless others. I mean, I think these two are probably the most prominent, but it's important to recognize that there were dozens, probably close to 100 different partnerships. But I think something else that's maybe overlooked is that the vast majority of these partnerships were focused on achieving the MDGs. So reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV, TB, malaria, and other diseases. So really these partnerships with the private sector focused largely on helping to achieve the MDGs, largely to help it accelerate progress towards the MDGs. But now the MDG era supposedly has ended. It was ended in 2015. As of 2016, at this point, close to 3 years ago, we're now in the era of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think I don't need to belabor this too much, but the SDGs are significantly different than the MDGs. It's profoundly different for health. The SDG agenda is much wider than the MDG agenda. It includes addressing NCDs, drugs, alcohol, having the numbers of road traffic injuries and deaths, ensuring reproductive and sexual health care services, achieving UHC, reducing the number of deaths and illness from pollution, as well as a focus on, quote unquote, means of implementation. So that's the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and NCDs, neglected diseases, improving human resources for health, and strengthening the IHR, the International Health Regulations. So this is a massive expansion of the global health agenda. SDG 3, while it's only one goal compared to the 3 goals of the MDGs, it's a significant widening of the focus to improve health and well-being. Now, with that expansion, I think we need to kind of reconsider the partnerships that we consider appropriate for global health. We need to ensure that our partnerships are compatible with SDG 3. And as I think, Jeff already alluded to, I think a good example is the Global Fund's partnership with Heineken. Now, the Global Fund has been working with Heineken since its inception, since 2001. I don't think it's raised too many heckles before. There's been some concerns raised, I believe, over a specific partnership in South Africa, but it largely, in the kind of MDG era, was simply accepted. A partnership working with Heineken to help achieve the fund's goals was tolerated, was accepted. I think that's increasingly no longer the case in the SDG era. Heineken is the world's 2nd largest beer brewer. It's been criticized for many of its questionable practices, particularly in African countries. But the Global Fund doesn't quite see it this way yet. While it won't work with the tobacco industry, the weapons industry, or the pornography industry, it still doesn't quite yet see a problem about working with the alcohol industry. In fact, it contends that its partnership with Heineken helps enable it to achieve its goals and contribute to SDG 3. That seems crazy to me. It basically ignores the 3.3 million lives that are lost annually to alcohol, which is incidentally more than HIV, tuberculosis. It's incidentally more than HIV, TB, and malaria combined. It also ignores and doesn't account for the implications of alcohol use in terms of NCDs and injuries, and the evidence of alcohol's role as a structural driver of HIV. So there's a challenge there. And there has been, I would say, this time around, when the fund announced an expanded partnership with Heineken earlier this year, there was widespread criticism. The fund responded eventually to suspend the partnership, although its reasoning for doing so was based on not the concerns raised from the NCD community, but rather around concerns of exploiting women to advertise and promote alcohol. So in that sense, the fund has not permanently terminated its partnership, or has it ruled out future partnerships with the alcohol industry? While I think this example singles out the Global Fund, singles out the alcohol industry as a potential partner, there are a number of other partnerships that we should, I think, reconsider, review in the SDG era. And I think this is, increasingly discussed and increasingly coming to the kind of top of the agenda. I think just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times covered the resignation of the chief medical officer at the American Cancer Society. While this official, I don't think, wanted to comment publicly, it was reported that those in touch with him said that he had become uncomfortable with the society's growing reliance on donations from businesses with questionable health credentials that he and others suspect are seeking to burnish their image. And I think this kind of encapsulates a lot of the struggle, a lot of the challenge of partnerships with the increasing recognition of the NCD epidemic. We're seeing increasing calls for regulation, and at the same time to kind of counterbalance that, to stall and limit the effects of these calls for regulations. I believe and would argue that we're going to see increasing and expanding efforts from the private sector to create partnerships. Looking at the participant list here and knowing who's here, I think it would be fairly straightforward and simple. We could all agree that there should be no partnerships with the tobacco and alcohol, and even probably the soda industry. But I think about where and when to partner with the broader food industry is probably a more complex conversation, which requires greater discussion and consideration. And I think, could be a role for a community of practice like this to begin to consider, okay, what might be or could be an improved framework or an improved kind of discussion dialogue around potential best practices for partnerships in the SDG era. I'm going to just stop there, but I'm looking forward to your feedback and your thoughts. Thank you for your attention.
Robert, thank you so much for that insight and or these insights, and also your opinion on the kind of sector inclusion or not. I think that's an extremely difficult question, and as we now move to the discussion phase of our webinar, I would directly pick up a question that was raised by Charles in the chat, and he writes, how can we make these topics easy to understand? When it comes to tobacco, answer is binary, just as you said, Robert, in a way. Tobacco kills. When it comes to food and drink, it is obviously more complex. What would be your recommendations to reach similar consensus to the one reached on tobacco consumption? So I would love to give that question directly back to the panelists, and I have no specific order for that. Is anyone volunteer? Does anyone volunteer? Charles also didn't mention a particular person.
I'm happy to jump in if you like.
Yes. So and Tim, your answer relatively short. We want to get more questions on, and I see that Jeff also raised his hand to give another answer.
Oh, okay. I didn't see a hand raising.
No worries.
Anyway, just to say quickly that we have struggled with this one too. Are there elements within the food industry that we feel we could work with, compared with those that we think are responsible for some of the more damaging products? And of course, the answer is yes. There are elements. There are those parts of the food industry that produce products that are recommended for increased consumption for good health, so fruits and vegetables and so on. And then there are parts of the supply chain that are not specifically producing or encouraging the consumption of some products over others. So supermarkets might be approachable and so on. So those are areas where we have been looking.
Now you're muted, Tim.
Yeah, I understood what I wanted to say.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Jeff.
Yeah. Just to add to what Tim said, really, I mean, I think the food industry isn't a very helpful label. I think that attempts to differentiate ultra-processed food and drinks industry as a particular component of a much wider sector, where, of course, there are all sorts of actors with whom different forms of engagement would be appropriate is helpful. I do also think that tobacco is not necessarily quite as binary as it suggests. Given the move towards e-cigarettes and potentially reduced risk products, but that what underlies tobacco control's position is a recognition of a fundamental conflict of interest, and I'd argue that conflict of interest is actually just as pronounced in relation to the alcohol industry and to parts of the food industry. We know, for example, that the alcohol industry in the UK, in South Africa, in Australia is reliant for between 2/3 and 4/5 of its profits on unambiguously harmful levels of drinking. Too often we get hung up on debates about individual level risk factors. We need to be taking much more structural, systemic understandings of conflict of interest when we think about scope for conversations. And to pick up on this about thinking about terms of engagement, of course it is important that we do proactively look to articulate areas where collaboration is appropriate, but that has to be within the context of much more careful and rigorous protections against conflict of interest.
Right, thanks, Jeff. Robert, I would move on to the next question. I hope that's fine, because that question goes directly to you, from Katia de Pino Campos. Hi, Robert. I understand very well your points regarding reconsidering PPPs. I have, in fact, spent my PhD studying public-private partnerships for health and healthy eating. And then later, she said, as a result of this study, a very comprehensive framework was developed to guide governments that are intending to develop PPPs. Although I'm fostering, she says, and promoting the discussion of commercial determinants of health, I also believe that we are crossing point to change the corporate practices, to change the business paradigm. Any comments by the other panelists? So a general question here: haven't we tried at all to make smart partnerships? Where is the failure here? And I want you to answer specifically to the discussion that we had so far and the sectors that we discussed. Robert, do you want to start? Even though the other panelists were also asked. Please unmute yourself in case you want to.
Sorry, yes, thank you. So thanks, Christian, and thank you, Katja, for the question. I mean, I think I would agree, and I think this links to the previous question. I would be satisfied actually if we got to a point where we viewed tobacco and alcohol in the same way. I think we're still a very far way away from that, unfortunately. I think for the food industry, I would again just agree with others. I think it's more difficult. Katja, I'm not familiar with your framework, although I'm just pulling it up on my screen now. I would love to go through this. I think what we do need, and I think probably maybe even building on your work, is a kind of broader discussion about the need for this type of framework within the global institutions, and I think obviously starting there with WHO is probably the best place to start. I think I would allude back to or recall Jeff's points from earlier on the difficulties and the challenges coming out of both Montevideo and the recent high-level commission and the high-level summit and meeting in New York. I think for the next couple of years, it's going to be difficult to make real progress, but I hope that maybe this community of practice can begin to kind of seed a discussion and create a potential, contribute to creating a consensus about a framework which will be useful when the political winds change and there's more political space at the global level to move forward on these sorts of agreements. So I'm hoping I've contributed to answer your question.
Jeff, do you have something to point towards that? I see your hand is raised, but please unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'd agree with much of what Robert's said there. And I guess in response to Katya's question, I don't think anybody's on the panel is suggesting that partnership is never appropriate, but that there shouldn't be a kind of default ideological commitment to partnership as the only way. And that is very much the dominant discourse within health and development. And I think NCDs provide a space where it's particularly important to question the dominance of that paradigm, particularly given that, you know, the one area of striking success has been tobacco control, which has challenged that fairly directly. So I do know Katya's framework. It's a very interesting one. There are others that have been developed. I think they do tend to begin from a starting point of favouring and operating in favour of presumption of partnership, rather than perhaps questioning more fundamentally who are the actors that we're looking to work with and what types of engagement are appropriate or possible for specific contexts.
Thanks a lot. I would love to move on or include one more question here. Unfortunately, we have, it seems, not enough time to deal with all the questions, but that's a good sign for the community of practice. But I would love to bring in Dorothea's, I hope the name is Dorota. Dorota's question, where she asks very concretely if we I'll read it to you. That's better to get the gist. What would be the best starting point to enter the systems approach to addressing the commercial determinants of health? Bottom up, upstream local initiatives, for example, to connect the dots, or top down, having a global framework convention that would try to regulate this, or both. How do we deal with that? Any preference from the panelists to answer that? So bottom up, top down. In case you wish to speak, please unmute yourself.
Okay, I suppose it raises a much bigger question about how do you get political change? How do you change? I mean, how are we going to get a responsible business model across society? How are we going to prevent competition leading to the cheapest of ingredients? How are we going to prevent overproduction? These are huge questions, and I'm not sure political change is simply divided between top up or top down or bottom up. In a sense, it needs everything and more besides. Over.
Right. Is there some, Jeff, do you want to respond to that too, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, of course, both. I think it's particularly important that we develop genuinely systems level understandings, but systems level doesn't just mean operating at those kind of outer tiers of the rainbow of social determinants. We need to be rethinking the healthy cities movement, for example. What would, if we took the idea of healthy cities seriously, what would be the different kind of regulatory and policy options that would be necessary to make meaningful progress on tackling NCDs at city level? I think there's all sorts of approaches to regulating marketing price availability at local level that we haven't begun to explore. I think the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control has been strikingly successful. There is increasing interest in developing that in other areas. I think the political barriers to doing that are pretty formidable. But we should be thinking about different ways of developing architecture and initiatives at the global level as well. But I guess consistent with the thrust of the question and with Tim's comment, I think systems levels approaches need to cut across these different levels of the stream, and upstream can be local as well.
Right. Thanks a lot. We are really approaching the end of the webinar, but there is one question of Bill that is for the future of the community of practice also extremely important. So literally he writes, what is the aim here? Doing more research or having some academics negotiate with massive companies to talk them into foregoing revenue, question mark. So I think that really goes as an important question also at the end of this community webinar, community of practice kickoff in the form of this webinar. And I would love to hear all panelists' opinions as we can't solve this in today's discussion. Like where's the aim of our work here? Where does this need to lead? And I would love to hear a short statement of all of you, maybe. Please unmute yourself. Why don't you start, Robert or Tim?
Well, I mean, it's it's an almost unanswerable, huge question. What is the aim of the process that we're trying to develop here? Is to, I think, to increase the politicization of the work that we do, to make us aware that we are embedded in a highly structured political, economic society, and that working on disease prevention actually requires a political approach. I think that's all I can add to that comment.
Right. Any other comment from Jeff, please?
Yeah, I mean, just the way in which Bill's posed the question, negotiating with massive companies to talk them into foregoing revenue, that's clearly not going to happen. Corporations are legally obliged to maximize shareholder revenue. In many respects, I think the problem here isn't corporations. They do what they're supposed to. The problem is often naivety in public health in terms of not really recognizing the limitations of what can be asked of them by way of voluntary initiatives and partnerships. And therefore, we need to think about much more ambitious regulatory approaches than have been attempted to date.
All right, Robert.
Yeah, no, and not much to add, just to echo Tim and Jeff. I wholly agree with their points, and also really appreciated Jeff's earlier point about starting from a point where we recognize the kind of neoliberal agenda of starting from the need for partnerships rather than starting from an earlier point where we actually kind of interrogate that need for a partnership, and instead begin to think of beginning with regulation for ensuring health. I think that's a better place to start.
Right. So I need to apologize to everyone else who raised the question. We got great questions. One, for example, being how do cultural aspects feature into the idea of Jeff and Tim, that it's the question of a vector maybe, and what do cultural aspects matter? Bill asked several more questions. We had Nicholas Freudenberg also as a participant who wanted to speak, and I would have loved to give him the floor. And I just have to ask you to get back to us. On Monday, you will be able to join the Knowledge Action Portal. There will be several more webinars. We, CPC Analytics, as a facilitator of this webinar, will be always open to any suggestion. Please approach us. Also, there was a comment earlier, a question about WHO PAHO organizing exactly on the same topic an event. I know of the American University of Beirut, in Beirut, that they work on similar topics more from the conflict of interest point of view. So we really aim to bring together people here. A last comment that I want to give you today, and I will briefly share my screen again for that. The community of practice is, of course, an attempt to bring together different sectors and, as we saw with the earlier questions, learn maybe from tobacco, but make it concrete towards the end, that this will not happen in the first month of the community of practice is for sure. I hope you can see my screen now. The slide that I wish to show you is this one here. which shows you the steering group members of the community of practice. And I don't want to go through all these people, but who have helped us a lot so far in building the first steps. But Charles Etienne Desidrac, for example, working in the insurance industry, and bringing in a question of what do capital flow matters, what does it matter for investors, what does it matter for us. We have Professor Peng Gong from China with us, who worked on the Healthy Cities Lancet Commission on China. And when speaking to him, he referred very much to the point that you mentioned, Jeff, rethinking healthy cities. Alejandro Calvillo Una, based in Mexico, will share on the Community of Practice platform, or will share his experiences on the fight for the sugar-sweetened beverage tax. So there is a lot more to come. There is a lot more to be discussed. We couldn't do it today. I hope that was fine. Please write to us all the questions that couldn't be answered. We will feed them into the Knowledge Action Portal. We will also respond to your wishes when it comes to what kind of topics will be relevant. And please, we will also send around a feedback, a wish to get feedback from you on this webinar. As I said, we will have more, and we want to improve as well as we go ahead with this project. So in that spirit, I would love to thank every one of you for joining. We had in total always an average of 50 participants and 150 registrations. We will stay in touch with you, and have a great evening or day or night. Thank you very much. And thanks also to the panelists for joining us.